Alright, let's talk about something that doesn't often get center stage in the lore-heavy world of Warhammer 40k. Something whispered about in fragmented records, redacted reports, and half-lost Vox logs. I'm talking about the ghosts of the Adeptus Astartes. Not literal specters, but the lingering presence of chapters that were meant to be, but somehow weren't. The ones that disappeared, failed, fell, or were wiped so clean from the records that only rumor and paranoia remain. These are the failed foundings, the chapters that didn't survive their birth or lived long enough only to vanish into silence. There's a strange allure to these stories, isn't there? Maybe it's the mystery, the sense that there are whole tales we'll never hear, pages ripped from the Book of Heroes. Or maybe it's something deeper, something in the grim-dark core of the setting itself, the understanding that not everything forged in the Emperor's name endures. The Imperium is built on the myth of eternal vigilance and strength, but what happens when its mightiest defenders are simply gone, forgotten, buried, erased? And yet, their echoes remain, in cursed relics, derelict fortresses, and the uneasy silence of battles that were never officially fought. The question is, do these chapters still haunt the Imperium in ways it refuses to acknowledge? When people talk about failed foundings, they often assume it means a chapter that turned traitor or got wiped out in some glorious last stand, but that's not really the heart of it. The term refers to something much stranger and much more unsettling. A failed founding is a Space Marine chapter that was officially created during one of the Imperium's authorized foundings, those massive waves of new gene-forged warriors meant to reinforce the Imperium's strength, but for some reason never truly came into being. Or if they did, they disappeared so completely that it's as if they were never there at all. Not every failure ends in a fiery death. Some just vanish into a void of silence. Others rot from the inside out long before anyone even notices. The thing is, foundings are big deals. They don't happen randomly. Each one is meticulously planned, well, as meticulously as anything gets in a galaxy-wide bureaucracy constantly under siege. The first founding gave us the original legions. The second was all about reforging those legions into smaller, more manageable chapters after the heresy. And from there, across dozens of additional foundings, the Adeptus Terra and the High Lords have tried to keep humanity protected by spawning more and more chapters. But even with all their planning, not every attempt sticks. That's where things get murky. Some chapters were never truly born. There are documented cases of entire foundings producing fewer than expected numbers of viable Space Marines. Sometimes the gene seed didn't take. Other times, the implantation process caused catastrophic mutations, organ rejection, hyperaggression, or complete systemic collapse. The administratum might scrub the records, claiming the data was corrupted or lost in transit. But occasionally, a name slips through. You see references in old, untranslated litanies or half-burned mission archives, names like the Steel Cobras or the Iron Hounds, units that don't appear on any modern roster. It's like catching a glimpse of a face in a crowd, only to turn your head and realize it's not there anymore. Then there are the chapters that did begin their lives in battle, forged from the gene seed of known Primarchs, trained in secret facilities, outfitted with war gear, and then just stopped reporting in. These aren't stories of dramatic last stands or grand betrayals. They're stories of silence, of entire ships full of Space Marines disappearing in the warp, of fortified keeps found empty and dust-choked. And every once in a while, there are whispered rumors from rogue traders or explorator fleets, tales of unknown Astartes operating far from Imperial space, wearing colors and heraldry no one recognizes. Not all failures are dramatic. Some are administrative disasters. In the grinding machinery of the Imperium, it's terrifyingly easy for an entire chapter to simply fall through the cracks. Supply lines dry up, training oversight gets lost, or a single inquisitorial edict, never explained, never justified, shuts down a project before it even gets off the ground. A chapter might be disbanded before they fire a single bolter round. Or worse, reassigned and absorbed into other forces without leaving behind a trace of their original name. The High Lords would never admit it, but these things happen. Records get misfiled. Histories are edited. Entire stories are overwritten like they were never meant to be remembered. And then, of course, there's the scariest possibility: corruption from within. Some foundings might have started strong, proper gene seed, well-led, well-armed, but something went wrong along the way. Maybe it was exposure to Xenos artifacts during their first campaigns. Maybe it was a flaw in their gene stock that took centuries to express itself. Maybe their chaplains failed to instill the necessary spiritual discipline, and the chapter slipped into decay. Whatever the cause, these chapters didn't fall in battle. They failed quietly, lost to madness, mutation, or heresy before anyone even noticed. Fandom circles are full of theories about which specific chapters were meant to exist, but don't. Some point to weird gaps in the founding registries, or oddly specific patterns in the spacing of known chapters. Why is there a blank where the auric sword should be? Why are there records of recruitment worlds assigned to no known chapter? Sometimes the theories get wild. Claims that certain foundings were never meant to succeed, that they were experiments in manipulation, loyalty, or even psychic potential. One particularly persistent theory is that the 13th founding was cursed from the start, riddled with high-risk chapters that were quietly erased when their flaws became too obvious. But that's the problem, isn't it? There are no definitive records, no clear confirmations. The Imperium doesn't do transparency. It does silence. It buries its failures beneath layers of bureaucracy and dogma. And that's exactly why failed foundings are so captivating. Because every blank space in the historical record is a story waiting to be uncovered. And when it comes to the Adeptus Astartes, even a whisper of mystery can ripple across the entire galaxy like the opening lines of a forgotten epic. If there's one thing that keeps me up at night about the lore, it's the chapters that feel like they were swallowed by the galaxy itself. Not the ones who turned to chaos or died with honor. No, I'm talking about those strange in-between cases, those chapters that existed, fought, bled, and then faded. The Firehawks, the Lamenters, the Flame Falcons, the Sons of Antias. Each of them is a mystery wrapped in fragments of war logs and whispers of catastrophe. They weren't just erased. They were swallowed by the Imperium's tendency to forget what it can't control. Let's start with the Firehawks. Their story always gives me chills. They were a fleet-based chapter with an aggressive crusading streak, fiery iconography, intense zeal, and a proud reputation. And then came the cursed founding. Around that time, the Firehawks were lost in the warp, their entire fleet vanishing en route to the Crow's World system. Officially, lost with all hands. But that wasn't the end. Not really. Sometime later, another group surfaced. The Legion of the Damned. Cloaked in black, wreathed in spectral fire, striking without warning and vanishing just as quickly. Their tactics, their armor, eerily reminiscent of the Firehawks. No one's confirmed it outright, of course. But among fans, it's one of the most widely believed ghost stories in the entire setting. What if the warp didn't just kill them? What if it changed them? And then there are the Lamenters. Emperor, the tragedy of the Lamenters is almost operatic. A chapter with a deeply melancholic theme, wrapped in the aesthetics of sorrow and penance, carrying the genetic legacy of Sanguinius. But they weren't simply unlucky, they were cursed. Every campaign they joined, no matter how noble their intentions, ended in betrayal, devastation, or horrific loss. During the Badab War, they fought with honor alongside the Astral Claws, believing they were siding with loyalists. When the truth emerged, the Lamenters paid the price. They were punished harder than most traitor chapters, many say unfairly so. Sent on a penitent crusade into the Galactic East, they encountered the Tyranids and were nearly wiped out. Some say they still fight on in scattered remnants, refusing to die. Others whisper that the Imperium considers them a lost cause, functionally dead. But to fans, they're never forgotten. They're the tragic heroes of a galaxy that has no place for poetry or pain. Now, the Flame Falcons. Their story is disturbing. They burned with a fervor that literally consumed them. At first, they were a success, zealous, powerful, effective. But then something changed. They began to burst into psychic flame during combat, not figuratively, literally. Their bodies ignited, their enemies burned, and their own marines often died screaming in the process. The Ecclesiarchy branded them mutants. The Inquisition declared them excommunicate traitores, not because they turned to chaos, but because they couldn't be explained. They vanished soon after, but the rumors never did. Some say they still fight, hidden in the deep void, their flames now controlled and focused like divine wrath. Others believe they ascended, becoming something more than human. And then there are the grim theories, that they were hunted down by Grey Knights and eradicated in silence. The Sons of Antias are another enigma entirely. They were physically massive, even by Astartes standards, slow, methodical, and nearly impossible to kill. Their resilience bordered on unnatural, and their tactics were brutally efficient. They didn't inspire fear in the same way as the others. They inspired unease. Too strong, too different. Theories abound that their gene seed was tampered with, maybe even fused with pre-heresy relics from forbidden vaults. There's little official record of them after their initial rise. Some say they still exist, operating in isolation. Others believe they were dismantled by the Inquisition when it became clear they couldn't be controlled. Their silence is what terrifies me most. They didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They just stopped being mentioned. It's not just the fate of these chapters that haunts me, it's what they represent. Each one is a case study in failure by the Imperium's own impossible standards. They didn't fall because they were weak or disloyal. They fell because they were different. And in the Imperium, being different is often the first step toward oblivion. These are the ghosts that linger not in haunted ships or ruined fortresses, but in data vaults and minds of those who remember. They're reminders that even the greatest warriors can be abandoned by the very system that created them. Fans debate endlessly about their final fates. Were the Lamenters finally destroyed by the Tyranids? Are the Flame Falcons now a demon host masquerading as loyalists? Do the Sons of Antias operate in the shadows, acting as Black Ops tools of the Ordo Malleus? No one really knows, and that's the beauty of it. In a setting like Warhammer 40K, where everything is loud and brutal and final, these quiet disappearances feel even more ominous. They hint at something bigger, something the Imperium doesn't want us to see. And maybe, just maybe, these chapters aren't as dead as we think. Maybe they're still out there, broken, bitter, and watching. There's something deeply unsettling about the way the Imperium handles its mistakes. It's not like they put up plaques or mourn the dead. When a chapter fails, when something goes wrong with its gene seed or a founding turns sour, it doesn't just die. It's buried, scrubbed, deleted, not mourned, not investigated, erased. That's the part that gets under my skin more than anything else. The idea that an entire brotherhood of Astartes, warriors forged from the Emperor's own genetic legacy, can vanish not in battle but in bureaucracy. And the scariest part? It's not just forgetfulness, it's deliberate. The Inquisition is at the heart of this silence. We always picture them hunting heretics, purging witches, and interrogating cults. But they're also editors of the Imperium's memory. They don't just fight corruption, they control the story. Especially the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Malleus, who are known to intervene when something starts deviating too far from the expected script. When a chapter shows signs of instability, when strange reports start trickling in, when unexplained behaviors emerge, sometimes the Inquisition doesn't warn or correct. They delete. And when they do, it's not with dramatic declarations or open confrontation. It's with quiet orders, sealed dossiers, and retroactive denials. There's this infamous story in fan circles, might be apocryphal, but it fits too well to ignore, about a scribe in the Administratum who stumbled on a set of data logs referencing a chapter he'd never heard of. Their campaigns, victories, even recruitment worlds. When he followed up, the terminals locked him out. Within a week, he was reassigned, his clearance downgraded. Every time he tried to ask questions, the records had already been altered. The chapter's name was gone. Even the planetary history had been rewritten to show no Astartes presence. It's the kind of story that makes you think twice about how many things have been quietly erased from history, and how many failed chapters we've already forgotten. We know for a fact that the Imperium has protocols for erasure. The concept of damnatio memoriae isn't new. It's ancient, even by our own standards. Entire traitor legions were wiped from records during and after the Horus Heresy. If it happened to the legions, it can happen to any chapter. The Inquisition has full authority to redact, censor, or eliminate anything deemed a threat to the Imperium's morale, stability, or theological orthodoxy. And failed foundings? They're perfect candidates. They undermine the myth of imperial perfection. They raise questions about the sanctity of the gene seed, the wisdom of the High Lords, and the security of humanity itself. It's easier to pretend they never existed. I've seen snippets of these redactions. Archived data lists with jump-cut numbers, where Chapter 312 suddenly skips to 314. Founding records where half the listed names are classified or pending approval, even though the founding happened thousands of years ago. And of course, there's the classic tactic, renaming. A chapter is declared lost, then re-emerges under a new name, new heraldry, new colors, as if reborn. But under the surface, it's still the same men, the same flaws, just papered over. Why does the Imperium do this? Some argue it's pragmatism, that in a galaxy this dangerous hope must be curated. If citizens believed the Emperor's angels of death could fail, could fall, could vanish, it would shatter the spiritual backbone of the Imperium. Others say it's political, a way for rival factions within the High Lords or the Inquisition to remove assets they don't control. A chapter that's too independent, too successful, too vocal. They're liabilities. Better to remove them quietly than risk open conflict. But there's another theory, one that sends shivers down my spine. What if some foundings were never meant to succeed? What if they were experiments, prototypes for psychic integration, gene seed enhancements, or behavioral modifications? And when they failed, they were buried not because they were dangerous, but because they were never supposed to be known. Maybe some chapters were created as bait for chaos, or as living weapons meant to burn bright and die fast. And when they fulfilled their purpose, or didn't, they were erased like spent ammunition. Fan forums are full of redacted names people try to reconstruct. You see lists with blacked out entries, and someone always posts a theory. This was the Spectral Wardens. Or that gap? Definitely the Onyx Reapers. It becomes a kind of collective necromancy, resurrecting the dead from digital dust and shared speculation. We're trying to remember what the Imperium insists we forget, because even if the names are gone, the wounds remain. And the silence. The silence screams louder than any bolter. So yeah, when we talk about failed foundings, we're not just talking about biological errors or battlefield losses. We're talking about state-sanctioned amnesia. We're talking about the machinery of forgetting. And every time we read a record that jumps too cleanly over the details, or a campaign that lists the Imperial fists as present when we know they weren't there, that's the ghost of a forgotten chapter flickering through the cracks in the Imperium's lies. If there's one area where the Imperium truly flirts with madness, it's in the tampering of gene seed. The raw genetic essence of the Primarchs is the holiest of relics, the divine spark from which all Astartes are forged. And yet, again and again, the High Lords and their shadowy allies have tried to reshape it, to push it further, twist it, weaponize it in ways even the Emperor probably never intended. And when those experiments go wrong, they don't just fail, they become nightmares. Failed foundings aren't always about war zones or political sabotage. Sometimes the horror starts at the cellular level. It's easy to forget that gene seed isn't stable. It decays. It mutates. Every generation of implantation brings risks. Slight shifts in behavior, morphology, compatibility. That's why most chapters are wary of deviation. But in the case of certain foundings, particularly the ones tied to the cursed founding, restraint went out the airlock. Someone, somewhere, greenlit a series of radical genetic modifications. They wanted stronger Astartes, faster development, psychic enhancement, better metabolic control. What they got instead were abominations. The Flame Falcons are often held up as the poster boys for this disaster, and yeah, we already touched on them. But what most fans don't realize is that their spontaneous combustion might not have been a freak occurrence. It may have been designed. There are old Mechanicus logs, heavily redacted, that hint at experiments with psi-reactive musculature and heat-channeling implants. The goal? To create shock troops that could unleash literal hellfire in close quarters. Problem is, it worked too well. The result wasn't controlled fury, it was self-immolation, and yet they were deployed anyway. And then there's the Black Dragons. Technically not a failed chapter, but they sit right on that razor's edge. Their gene seed causes prominent weapon-like mutations, bone spurs, blade-like growths, clawed extremities. The Codex Astartes calls them abominations, and most Imperial commanders refuse to work alongside them. But they're effective. Brutally so. Their existence raises questions that make the Inquisition very nervous. Were they a deliberate experiment in biological weaponry, or a mutation that was never intended, but tolerated because it produced results? Some argue they're the survivors of a botched gene seed program, repackaged and quietly sanctioned. Others believe they're ticking time bombs that will one day erupt into full-scale corruption. And we can't ignore the sons of Antias. Again, they haven't been officially declared failures, but come on, just look at them. Their size, their stamina, their immunity to conventional pain and trauma. It's unnatural, even for Astartes. Rumors suggest their gene seed was enhanced using lost Martian biotech. There's even talk of pre-heresy cloning tech being used to alter their osmodula and biscopia, making them bigger and more durable than anything that came before. But if that's true, what was sacrificed in exchange? What did the original gene stock look like, and what did they have to graft onto it to get the results we see? Their absence from most modern campaigns is telling. Maybe they're being kept in reserve. Or maybe someone decided they were too dangerous to let roam free. And what about the chapters we never saw? The ones who didn't even make it to the battlefield? There are reports, fragmented, inconsistent, but compelling, of entire foundings that suffered catastrophic biological failure before reaching operational status. Neurons that never fired correctly, aggression levels off the charts, Astartes turning on their own training cadres, even developing warp sensitivity that drove them mad. They were terminated, of course, but not just killed, purged, sterilized, vaporized, and the records gone, like they were never born at all. Some of the wildest theories come from those little mentions in obscure lore books, the kind you only find in limited editions or old White Dwarf interviews. One describes a chapter whose gene seed caused progressive ossification, turning its members into living statues over the course of decades. Another hints at Marines whose senses became so heightened they could no longer function, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the warp and the screaming thoughts of mortals around them. These aren't just failed soldiers. They're genetic tragedies, reminders of how far humanity is willing to go in the name of survival or supremacy. And of course, whenever this topic comes up, fans love to drag the Adeptus Mechanicus into the conversation. After all, they're the ones doing most of the tinkering. They guard the gene vaults, they conduct the tests, and when something goes wrong, they're the first to slap a purity seal over the mess and pretend nothing happened. Some claim there are secret forges dedicated entirely to next-gen Astartes, improved warriors who'll never see the light of day unless the Imperium becomes truly desperate. Others say these experimental Marines have been deployed, quietly, surgically, in places where deniability is key. What I find most heartbreaking is the idea that some of these Space Marines knew they were flawed. Imagine going through the brutal training, surviving the implantation process, fighting for the Emperor, and realizing deep down that you're a mistake, that your brothers are dying around you because something in your blood isn't right, that you were never meant to last. That kind of existential horror hits hard. It's not corruption or betrayal, it's helplessness. And in the grimdark future, there's no redemption for genetic error. There's just silence. So when people talk about failed foundings, they often think in terms of war zones and lost banners. But sometimes the failure happens before the first battle even begins. In the lab, in the tube, in the tiny cracks of a genome that should never have been touched. These aren't just lost chapters. They're broken dreams, twisted science, and desperate gambles played out on the bones of post-human warriors who never got to be heroes. Sometimes the real enemy doesn't come screaming out of the warp or crashing in from the stars. Sometimes it's already inside the gate, silent, patient, and wearing the same armor as you. It's easy to imagine the downfall of a chapter as the result of overwhelming force, a disastrous campaign, or some ancient curse etched into their gene seed. But what if the collapse comes from within? What if a chapter destroys itself, not with bolters and blades, but through pride, division, or the slow unraveling of unity? That idea unsettles me more than any demon. We know Space Marines aren't just soldiers. They're zealots, warriors bound by ritual, belief, and tradition. Their loyalty to the Emperor is burned into their souls, but even so, they're still men beneath the ceramite. And men fracture. Over time, even the most disciplined brotherhoods can split under the weight of ideology, trauma, or ambition. There are whispers, half-legends really, of chapters that turned on themselves, not because of chaos or corruption, but because they couldn't agree on who they truly were anymore. One name that keeps resurfacing in fan theories is the Night Reapers. Officially, they never existed. But according to fragmented Vox logs and a few errant mentions in old campaign records, they were a chapter created during a later founding, specialized in long-term terror campaigns and psychological warfare. The problem wasn't their methods, it was their mindset. Some say they became obsessed with the effectiveness of fear itself, questioning whether devotion to the Emperor even mattered if fear alone could pacify entire systems. That philosophical drift caused a rift in the command structure. Half the chapter held to traditional Imperial doctrine. The other half wanted to reforge their purpose around pure utility. The schism turned violent. By the time the Inquisition arrived, the fighting had already consumed their fortress monastery. No survivors were recorded, just a burned-out shell, scorched with conflicting heraldry. Then there are rumors about the Obsidian Maul, another chapter lost to time said to have operated in the Segmentum Obscurus. They were known for their brutal discipline and total rejection of outside assistance. What began as stoic self-reliance gradually spiraled into isolationism. Their commanders began hoarding information, refusing all orders from Terra. Some records suggest they turned against their own librarians, declaring psychic power an impurity. That internal purge fractured the chapter's leadership, and by the end, the Maul had split into two war bands, one loyal to the Codex, one loyal to their reclusive chapter master. They clashed in orbit above a mining world, a battle that lasted days and ended with both strike cruisers detonating in a suicidal last strike. No one came to claim the wreckage. The thing is, these stories aren't so far-fetched. Even within the Codex-compliant chapters, we do know there are recorded tensions. Look at the Flesh Terrors. Their instability, their rage, it's legendary. Gabriel Seth has to keep his warriors in line with sheer force of will. But what if he hadn't? What if a Flesh Terror successor chapter inherited even worse instability and didn't have someone like Seth to anchor them? What would stop them from turning inward the moment discipline cracked? There's a theory in the fan community that the further removed a chapter is from its Primarch's legacy, the more fragile its identity becomes. Foundings stacked on top of foundings, each one a copy of a copy, start to dilute the original doctrine. Over time, chapters develop mutations, Not just in their gene seed, but in their traditions, their beliefs, even their view of the Imperium itself. Some begin to see themselves not as servants, but as judges. Others turn inward, obsessing over esoteric rituals or ancient grudges. When those beliefs conflict with the wider Imperium, or with other factions within the chapter, the result isn't always heresy. Sometimes it's war. One of the creepiest fan theories I've read was about a chapter called the Sentinels. No official record of them exists, but the theory goes that they were a cursed founding experiment meant to specialize in psychic warfare and long-term reconnaissance. They were deployed in isolated systems for decades at a time, operating without oversight. When Imperial contact was finally re-established, the chapter had split into multiple ideological sects, each convinced the others were imposters or corrupted. The ensuing civil war supposedly destroyed half a dozen inhabited worlds before the Segmentum Command issued a scorched earth directive. The worst part? Some players believe the Sentinels weren't destroyed at all, just scattered. Their fragments still operate in the shadows, each claiming to be the true Sentinels. It makes you wonder, how many chapters have disappeared, not because of some cosmic threat, but because they simply couldn't hold themselves together, because they grew too far apart, philosophically, spiritually, even biologically. Maybe some chapters weren't corrupted, maybe they just broke, under pressure, under doubt, under the unbearable weight of being something more than human and less than divine. We always talk about chaos as the great corruptor, but maybe the real horror lies in what happens when loyalty becomes obsession, when order mutates into tyranny, when purpose curdles into pride. Maybe some chapters never needed demons to fall. They just needed time, isolation, and a few bad choices. And in the silence that follows, the Imperium once again picks up the eraser, wiping the slate clean, pretending those brothers never lived and never died by each other's hands. There's something oddly romantic and deeply unsettling about the idea of a chapter that refuses to die. Not in the sense of stubborn survival through apocalyptic war, but in a quieter, more spectral way. The idea that some of these so-called failed chapters didn't vanish at all, that instead of dying, they simply slipped away, shedding their colors and names like a snake's skin and becoming something other, something half-seen, something that lingers just outside the official record. It's one of the most persistent fan obsessions out there. The theory that lost chapters still operate, not as recognized forces, but as ghostly remnants, secretive brotherhoods that fight the enemies of mankind from the shadows or perhaps pursue darker missions entirely. The most famous example that always comes up in these conversations is the Legion of the Damned. And yeah, we've all heard the theory that they're what remains of the Firehawks, consumed by the warp and reborn in fire and vengeance. Whether or not that's true, what matters is the idea behind it, that a chapter can undergo a kind of death and resurrection, shedding its original purpose to become something mythic. There are whole strands of lore that treat the Legion less like a real fighting force and more like a supernatural phenomenon. They appear, they intervene in doomed battles, and then they're gone. No contact, no explanation, just scorch marks and skulls. But the Legion aren't the only ones fans speculate about. There's talk of the Pale Blades, a supposed chapter that was lost during the Moros Crusade, whose colors and records were purged following a failed compliance operation in Segmentum Pacificus. According to some scattered survivor accounts, a force matching their heraldry was seen years later on a dead Forge moon, fighting an unknown enemy in total silence, their armor repainted black and their iconography defaced. Officially, the moon was uninhabited. The witnesses were dismissed as stress victims. But the story keeps popping up. Always the same description. Always the same sense that they were never meant to be seen. There's another persistent rumor about the Void Jackals, a chapter supposedly lost in a warp rift 3 centuries ago. They were declared annihilated. A monument was erected in their honor on Terra's memory vaults. And yet, in the deep void near the Halo stars, multiple rogue trader vessels have reported being escorted away from restricted zones by Astartes in unmarked armor, their voices distorted, their symbols erased. When pressed, the Inquisition denies any knowledge. But one trader uploaded a low-res pict capture of the encounter before his vessel was impounded. It shows a silhouette unmistakably Astartes, except the shoulder pads are scraped clean. No chapter, no name, just the cold gaze of someone who's still fighting long after they were written off. And then you've got the comparisons to the Phantom Legions, specifically the missing 2nd and 11th. We all know those are forbidden topics in Imperial archives, but there's a theory that they weren't just deleted, they were fragmented, their remnants scattered, reshaped, folded into successor chapters, or kept in stasis for contingency plans. If that sounds like wild speculation, it is. But isn't that the nature of secrecy in the Imperium? The less you're allowed to know, the more your mind fills in the gaps. Some fans think that these shadow chapters are fragments of lost legions still carrying out their own clandestine wars, following programming no one remembers, answering to commands that haven't been given in 10,000 years. The notion of chapters surviving in the shadows makes a strange kind of sense, though. Think about it. If a chapter is declared lost, but a fragment survives, say a single company or even a squad, they might not have the means to re-establish themselves officially. They'd be ghosts, forced to steal supplies, hijack transmissions, blend into the war zones of others. Maybe they answer distress calls from isolated worlds. Maybe they prey on Xenos convoys, operating without authorization. Maybe they've rewritten their own purpose entirely. After all, once the Imperium writes you off, who's really left to tell you what to do? What I love about this idea is how it challenges the rigid hierarchy of the Imperium. A chapter outside the system becomes something purer or darker. No chaplains to guide their faith. No reclusiarchs to remind them of their oaths. Just the original mission, buried deep in their memory cores, warped by time and desperation. Some fans even theorize that these lost chapters form alliances with one another, operating like a hidden council, a brotherhood of the erased. They don't call themselves chapters anymore, just remnants, ghosts. There are even scattered rumors of the Imperium deliberately tolerating such groups, that the Inquisition or Officio Assassinorum makes use of these spectral warriors for deniable operations. Need a heretic cult eliminated without trace? Drop coordinates into the old astropathic channels and wait. If they show up, no questions asked. No survivors either. It's a stretch, sure, but in a galaxy this broken, does it really sound impossible? Maybe the saddest part is imagining what life is like for these space marines, stripped of identity, living off scavenged parts, painting over their old colors to survive. Brothers lost, records gone, their entire legacy denied. Yet they fight on, not for glory, not for praise, but because it's all they've ever known. They are the chapters that refuse to die, not heroes, not traitors, just forgotten sons of a forgotten war. And maybe that's the point. Maybe they don't want to be remembered. Maybe the silence is the only thing keeping them sane. Or maybe they're just waiting for the day they can rise again, not as ghosts, but as something the Imperium will have to reckon with. Even when they're gone, they're not really gone. That's one of the most haunting truths about the Adeptus Astartes. Chapters that have been declared lost, destroyed, purged, or simply forgotten still manage to leave fingerprints across the galaxy. Not in obvious ways, no banners waving over battlefields, no speeches carved into marble, but in subtle echoes, in scars that never fully close. The Imperium is a place of legacy, repetition, and ritual, and even its failures have a way of surviving, especially when those failures are wrapped in ceramite and myth. Take gene seed, for example. It's not just the foundation of a space marine's body, it's memory, bloodline, psychic resonance. Every chapter carries echoes of its parent, and through them, the echoes of the ones that came before. If a chapter is destroyed, its gene seed doesn't always vanish with it. Sometimes it's recovered, stored, reused. We don't know all the sources the Adeptus Mechanicus draws from when creating new foundings, but it's clear that legacy doesn't die just because a name has been erased. There's a theory that some current chapters might be walking ghosts, built on the gene stock of chapters that were meant to be forgotten. And if that's true, then their failures, their flaws, and even their ideals are still echoing through warriors who don't even know whose shadow they stand in. I've read speculation that some of the more unpredictable behaviors seen in modern chapters, unusual rituals, unorthodox tactics, or sudden surges of psychic instability, might be traces of these forgotten ancestors rising to the surface. Not in a literal sense, but like a dream half-remembered. Maybe a chaplain dreams of a battle he never fought, speaks words no one taught him. Maybe a newly promoted captain finds himself instinctively using a maneuver that hasn't been practiced for millennia. These things are often explained away as visions from the Emperor or echoes of the Primarchs. But what if there's something else? What if they're inherited trauma? Old enemies remember too. Xenos races like the Elder, and even the Necrons, are long-lived enough to remember the names of chapters the Imperium no longer acknowledges. There are incidents where Astartes' forces are attacked without provocation, and it's unclear why, until you look deeper and realize the new chapter shares a homeworld or iconography with one that committed some forgotten atrocity centuries ago. The galaxy remembers. It has long memory and no interest in whether the Imperium thinks something is still official. The sins of the forgotten still draw blood. And allies. Sometimes allies remember more than the Imperium wants. There are forge worlds that still maintain statues to chapters whose names have been stricken from Imperial records. PDF commanders who pass down stories of valiant warriors in colors that no longer appear on the official rosters. Sometimes it's just tradition. Sometimes it's stubborn pride. But every once in a while, it's something more. A shared campaign. A bond forged in war that no Inquisitor's edit can truly erase. Even when the records say a chapter never existed, the battlefield still bears its footprint. You also see it in the relics, artifacts that no one can trace. Power armor engraved with sigils that don't match any recorded chapter. Blade patterns that predate current Forge World designs by centuries. Sometimes these are dismissed as decoration or looted spoils. But what if they're remnants? Tools passed down from the dead to the living, either through scavenging or intention. Some modern chapters even revere these untraceable relics as divine anomalies, building entire rituals around them, completely unaware they're kneeling before the legacy of a failed founding. There's one particular case that always comes up on lore forums, the tale of a reclusiarch from a known chapter who received visions during a long warp transit. He claimed to be visited by black-armored warriors who warned him of a rising Xenos threat. The visions led his strike force to a backwater world that turned out to be infested with genestealers. His actions saved millions. No one knows who the black-armored warriors were, and no one's ever seen them again. Were they ghosts? Echoes of a dead chapter trying to fulfill one last mission through another's hands? Sometimes these echoes aren't even conscious. They exist in symbols, colors, names, patterns. A chapter might choose a heraldry without realizing it mimics that of a long-lost predecessor. Or perhaps a tech marine installs a specific rite into the machine spirit of a dreadnought, unaware he's repeating a pattern used by a now-purged chapter. It's like ripples in the warp. You can't always see the source, but you feel the disturbance. And the deeper you look, the more you realize how little of the past is ever truly buried. What's even more unnerving is that some of the surviving chapters might know this, that they carry the weight of the forgotten on purpose. There are rumors, just whispers really, that certain chapters take it upon themselves to remember the erased, that within their vaults are relics not of their own line, but of broken lines. They guard these legacies in secret, honor the fallen in silent rites, and refuse to let the Imperium's failures be scrubbed away entirely. They act like living memory banks, preserving what bureaucratic decree would rather see vanish. The dead don't rest easily in the Imperium. Not when their armor is still in circulation, their tactics still employed, their warnings still echoing through psychic space. Even if their banners have been taken down, their ghosts still march beside the living, sometimes as protectors, sometimes as warnings, but always as reminders that nothing in the galaxy ever truly disappears. Not victories, not failures, and certainly not the Space Marines who bore the weight of both. If there's one thing more terrifying than being forgotten by the Imperium, it's being remembered by the wrong people. Because once your name ends up on the wrong data slate, once the wrong eyes linger too long on your existence, it's over. And when it comes to hunting ghosts, no one does it more thoroughly than the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Malleus. These branches of the Inquisition don't just clean up heresy and demonic threats, they also bury secrets. And some of those secrets wear power armor. It's not officially acknowledged, of course. There are no public bulletins announcing a kill order on a wayward chapter. But every now and then, a pattern emerges. A strike cruiser detonated in transit. A fortress monastery that suffered an unexplained reactor overload. A chapter declared lost in the warp when the local report suggests their beacon was strong and steady until the very moment it winked out. You start to wonder, were these truly accidents? Or was someone making sure a story ended before it got too loud? There's a persistent story in the fan community about a chapter known as the Spectral Blades. Supposedly created during the Cursed Founding, they specialized in psychic warfare and arcane rituals bordering on sorcery. No known battle records exist after their third campaign. But there's a data point, a single mention in a redacted Ordo Malleus archive about an Astartes cult engaging in prescribed psychic architecture. No names, no location, just a note, cleansed, no survivors. People argue over whether it was the Spectral Blades or some unrelated rogue unit, but the implication sticks. If a chapter crosses into forbidden territory, even by accident, the Inquisition acts fast. And final. Then there's the question of who actually pulls the trigger. The Inquisition isn't an army. It's a network of operatives, agents, and manipulators. But when a ghost chapter needs to be silenced, they don't hesitate to call on the big guns. Death Watch kill teams, Eversor assassins, or even sanctioned exterminatus if things are bad enough. That's the scariest part. They don't always fight fair. They don't need to. They'll declare you corrupted, heretical, or tainted by the unknown, and that'll be enough. No trial, no redemption, just silence. There's also this weird gray zone of inquisitors who don't want the ghosts dead. Some seem almost obsessed with them. There are rumors of Ordo Xenos agents keeping private vaults full of relics tied to erased chapters, scraps of armor, purity seals, broken bolters. One theory is that they're trying to reconstruct the truth behind the foundings, piecing together a forbidden history that the High Lords buried. Others think they're trying to find ways to weaponize the remnants, use forgotten tactics, study lost mutations, revive the past in secret. And if they're doing that, they're not going to let anyone else know. But when someone outside the Ordo stumbles too close, that's when the knives come out. There was this story, half fan fiction, half recovered Vox log, about a rogue trader named Alestus Varn who reportedly encountered a group of Astartes on a dead world near the Ghoul Stars. They didn't match any known chapter, and they weren't friendly. He returned to Imperial space with fragments of footage and a gene seed sample. Within weeks, his entire fleet was confiscated, his crew quarantined, and his name struck from the registries. The Inquisition never confirmed any of it. But the footage still circulates if you know where to look. And what it shows, they were Astartes, just not the kind anyone wants to admit exists. Another chilling theory? That the Inquisition doesn't just hunt the remnants, but tests them. There are whispers about Ordo Malleus task forces deliberately releasing demon hosts or Xenos tech into isolated zones where forgotten Astartes are rumored to operate. To see what they'll do. To judge if they're still useful. or if it's time to clean house. It sounds insane, right? But then you look at the history of what the Inquisition has done to its own, and it starts to feel a little too plausible. Sometimes I wonder if the Inquisition is more afraid of the forgotten chapters than they are of chaos. A traitor can be fought, a demon can be banished. But a chapter that shouldn't exist? That obeys no lord, that follows ancient doctrines, that remembers things no one is supposed to know. That's a threat to the very narrative of the Imperium, and that makes it a target. The worst part is that some of these ghost chapters might not even realize they've been marked. They're still fighting for humanity, still protecting worlds, still dying by the thousands in forgotten systems. But their names been scratched from the records, their homeworlds sterilized, their signals jammed. They're already dead in the eyes of the Imperium. They just haven't stopped moving yet. And so the hunt goes on. Quiet, relentless, unspoken. The Ordo Hereticus looks for signs of ideological corruption. The Ordo Malleus scans for warp taint. Every now and then, a report leaks. A ghost ship found drifting, filled with unfamiliar Astartes corpses. An entire PDF garrison wiped out by friendly fire during a training incident. No explanations. Just the feeling that something was cleaned up, that a name was buried deeper. In a way, the ghosts of failed chapters haunt not just the battlefield, but the minds of the Inquisition itself. They're reminders of experiments that went too far, of truths that refused to stay hidden. And the Imperium, terrified of cracks in its perfect facade, sends its hounds to make sure those truths stay buried, even if it means killing its own sons. There's a question that always simmers just below the surface whenever we talk about failed foundings, one that makes even the most die-hard loyalists shift uncomfortably. What if some of these chapters didn't die? What if they didn't go down in a blaze of loyalist glory, or get wiped out by tyrannids, or disappear into the void? What if they fell? Not into darkness metaphorically, but literally, into the embrace of chaos. Because if there's anything the ruinous powers love more than war, it's broken hope. And failed chapters? They're full of it. The thought keeps me up at night. A brotherhood of gene-forged warriors, trained for decades, stripped of identity by the Imperium itself, forgotten, disavowed, betrayed. What's left for them but hate? And chaos is always waiting, always watching. You don't have to paint your armor red and start worshipping skulls overnight. Sometimes all it takes is silence, desperation, a prayer shouted into the void with no answer. And then something whispers back. There are a handful of alleged examples that get talked about in fan circles, though none of them are officially confirmed for obvious reasons. One of the most famous is the Ashen Blades. Supposedly a chapter lost during a warp storm in the Segmentum Tempestus, they were written off after failing to report in for over a century. Then, decades later, several Black Legion warbands began to field warriors wearing armor with fragmented heraldry that matched old Ashen Blade patterns, tarnished silver and blood-black symbols. No official source ever verified the connection, but the resemblance is too strong for coincidence. Some even say the blades didn't turn for power or vengeance. They just gave up. They stopped believing anyone was coming to rescue them. It's not always so dramatic. Sometimes it's a slow rot. The Flame Falcons, who we've talked about before, have long been a topic of speculation. Their fire-wreathed bodies, their mutation, their silence, it all fits the profile of warp exposure. Sure, the official story is that they were purged for mutation, not heresy. But do we really believe the line is that clean? Maybe some of them did survive. Maybe they embraced the fire, let it consume not just their bodies but their souls, and walked straight into the waiting arms of Tzeentch or Slaanesh. After all, both of those gods love excess, one through change, the other through sensation. What better toys than warriors burning alive, unable to stop the pleasure and the pain? There's also the more abstract idea that some chapters might not even realize they've turned. Imagine a brotherhood pushed so far into isolation, so far from any anchor of the Imperium, that they start making compromises. Small ones at first, alliances with questionable psychers, rituals borrowed from Xenos cultures, shortcuts in genetic repair. And slowly, they drift. Not into open worship of the dark gods, but into that gray fog where loyalty starts to crack. The Inquisition might call them heretics. They might call themselves survivors. But chaos? Chaos just calls them ready. One of my favorite theories, and I admit, it's totally unconfirmed, probably fan fiction at this point, is about a group called the Hollow Saints. The story goes that they were part of a late founding, created with unstable gene seed and sent on long-range missions beyond the Astronomican's reach. Isolated, forgotten, and increasingly fractured, they began to receive visions. Not demons, not nightmares, but comfort. A voice promising salvation. A presence that gave them direction, unity, even peace. When the Imperium finally found them again, they were changed. Serene, cold, unquestionably effective, and no longer interested in contact. Their enemies vanished. Their allies refused to speak. Until one day, the Hollow Saints disappeared altogether. Some say they're still out there, serving a god they don't even recognize as chaos. A god of order, control, and stillness. The kind of god a broken space marine might mistake for the Emperor. It's easy to see why the Imperium wants to erase these stories. A fallen chapter is more than a military loss. It's a spiritual wound. If a chapter can turn after being trained, blessed, and forged in the Emperor's image, what does that say about the process? About the Emperor himself? The High Lords would rather declare a chapter lost in action than admit they turned to the gods of the warp. It's cleaner that way. It keeps the myth intact. But among fans, we know better. We see the cracks. Even the traitor warbands themselves sometimes hint at strange origins. There are Chaos Marines who bear no known heraldry, who speak in dialects that don't match any legion. Some call them the Nameless. Others say they are the orphans of failed foundings, chapters the Imperium discarded, who found a new family in the Eye of Terror. And if that's true, it's a chilling thought. Because for every fallen angel or word-bearer you can track, there might be 10 more ghost chapters out there, burning with righteous fury, convinced they're still fighting for humanity, even as their actions turn more and more monstrous. Chaos doesn't always come screaming. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it comes dressed as mercy. And for a space marine cast out by his own kind, mercy can be the most dangerous temptation of all. So yes, it's absolutely possible that some failed. Chapters didn't vanish or die. They were just redirected, bent, broken, and reforged into new shapes by powers that feed on pain, pride, and purpose. They don't call themselves traitors. They don't wear the Eye of Horus. But they no longer stand in the Emperor's light. And the worst part? They might think they still do. Even when the warriors are gone, their fortresses remain. Their ships drift. Their vaults stay locked. That's one of the most chilling things about the so-called dead chapters. They leave behind relics that refuse to fade. You can purge a name from a record, delete a heraldry from the archives, even burn the last warrior to ashes. But a fortress monastery doesn't just vanish. A battle barge doesn't just disintegrate. The galaxy is littered with the bones of the forgotten. And the Imperium? It doesn't know what to do with them. Some of these ruins are out in the void, left to drift in silence. Derelict ships, scarred and unresponsive, their transponders deactivated but not dead. There are rumors of black ships passing them in the dark, massive Astartes vessels from chapters no one can name, their hulls marked with faded sigils, their machine spirits still humming with fragmentary code. Sometimes salvage teams are sent in. Sometimes they don't come back. Other times, the Adeptus Mechanicus shows up and quietly tows the wreck into a quarantine orbit, never explaining why. What do they find in there? What secrets are stitched into those bulkheads? We don't know, and maybe we're not meant to. And then there are the crypts, I remember reading about a world in the eastern fringe, long since declared uninhabitable. But deep beneath the ash plains, beneath kilometers of fused stone, they found vaults. Chambers filled with empty sarcophagi, gene vats, and dreadnought shells waiting for warriors who would never return. No name was listed. No chapter claimed the place. But the iconography was unmistakably Astartes. The Mechanicus sealed it again. Contaminated site, they said. But someone had built it, supplied it, blessed it, and someone had meant for it to be used. Some fans think it was a startup fortress for a chapter that never made it past implantation. Others think it was a cloning reserve for one of the cursed foundings, hidden away as insurance. Either way, it's still there, still waiting. It's not just about the structures, it's what's inside them. Armor pieces bearing symbols that don't exist in current lexicons. Weapons with inscriptions written in dialects that haven't been spoken in 10,000 years. And sometimes, things that shouldn't exist. Modified bolters, arcane biomantic tech, even fragments of gene seed storage modules that don't match any known design. The kind of stuff that makes the Ordo Malleus twitch. The kind of stuff that gets labeled radically divergent tech purge pending. But the Imperium doesn't always destroy these relics. Sometimes it repurposes them. There are confirmed cases of successor chapters inheriting gear from predecessors that no longer exist on the rolls. The official story is always the same, salvaged from a long-lost crusade, or assigned by Mechanicus rediscovery teams. But behind closed doors, the whispers say something different. That some of these chapters are walking around in the gear of the dead. That their power armor was once worn by a brother whose name has been forbidden. That the fortress they now call home once rang with battle cries the Imperium no longer admits were real. And that's the eerie part. Those ghosts never really leave. A fortress monastery has its own soul. A machine spirit shaped by the prayers, memories, and deaths of those who walked its halls. Imagine a new chapter moving into a keep where another once fell. Training in the same arenas. Praying at the same shrines, but feeling something else. Whispers, shifts in air pressure, visions during meditation rites. Chaplains write it off as spiritual turbulence, the price of sanctifying an old place. But we all know better. That's the residue of memory. That's the legacy of the forgotten. Some say the Inquisition hides more than ruins. They hide entire arsenals. That in the deepest vaults beneath Terra, or in off-grid asteroid repositories, lie the weapons of failed chapters. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're inconvenient. Too unique, too suggestive of past failures. Maybe some of them were prototypes, gifted to foundings that were never meant to last. Maybe they were weapons meant for wars that didn't happen. Either way, the Imperium would rather keep them locked away than admit what they mean. There's a theory about the silent deck of the Arkhold Calestis. It's a section of a massive space hulk, quarantined by the Adeptus Mechanicus, where the environmental systems still run, despite no confirmed life signs in over 3 centuries. Explorator teams have reported fully intact Astartes armor stands, untouched briefing rooms, tactical cogitators still running ancient battle simulations. But no names, no icons, just the sound of doors hissing open and shut on their own. One servitor described it as a garrison without memory. The Mechanicus refused to comment. Every now and then, a war zone opens up on a planet where a new chapter deploys for the first time. Their heraldry is unfamiliar, their demeanor cold and efficient. They don't speak to other Imperial forces. They don't broadcast their name. But their armor is old, pre-heresy in some cases, and their weapons bear markings long since erased from the registers. Are they truly new? Or are they revenants using the tools of a chapter that no longer exists to fight a war no one remembers? This is why fans like me get obsessed with this stuff. Because for all the grand campaigns and epic battles, it's the silence that speaks loudest. The empty crypts, the sealed vaults, the derelict ships drifting near forbidden stars. Every one of them is a question the Imperium doesn't want to answer. Every relic of a dead chapter is a reminder that not everything was built to last, and that even the Emperor's angels can vanish without a trace. But nothing ever truly disappears in the grim darkness of the far future. The machine spirits remember. The stone remembers. And if you listen closely, sometimes you'll hear a name echo through the vox that was never supposed to be spoken again. Not a ghost. Not quite. Just a shadow of something the Imperium tried and failed to forget. So, are the dead chapters really dead? After diving into all of this, the failures, the ghosts, the secrets buried in vaults and warp storms, it's hard to say yes with any confidence. The Imperium would love for you to believe that failure is simple, that a chapter either lives or dies, that if you can't find it in the records, it never existed. But the truth, like everything in this universe, is messier. Because when you peel back the layers of denial, redaction, and silence, you start to see the outline of something else. Something still moving, still breathing, still fighting in the margins of history. Maybe death, in the context of the Adeptus Astartes, isn't as final as we think. A chapter might lose its name, its home, its official status, but that doesn't erase the blood in its veins or the fury in its soul. And when you look at all the signs, forgotten heraldry, broken ships, unmarked armor, battlefield behavior that doesn't match any known formation, you start to wonder, how many of these dead chapters are actually out there? Watching, acting, waiting. And maybe that's what really haunts the Imperium. Not the failure itself, but the survivors of failure. The warriors who weren't supposed to go on, but did anyway. The remnants who carry their purpose like a scar. The Inquisition tries to bury them, the Administratum tries to rewrite them, and the Mechanicus tries to strip them for parts. But you can't always kill an idea, especially not one shaped in the image of a god. And what does that say about failure in the Imperium? Honestly, the more I think about it, the more I realize that failure in this universe isn't about weakness or defeat. It's about not fitting the script. If a chapter doesn't conform, if its gene seed is too strange, its behavior too unpredictable, its victories too complicated, then it risks erasure. But maybe those failures are the closest thing the Imperium has to truth. Raw, unpolished, imperfect truth. Because they show what happens when the machinery of war gets too ambitious or too desperate. It makes you reevaluate the whole concept of a founding. We always think of them as moments of hope, of reinforcement. But some foundings were always doomed, pushed too far, too fast, cut with unstable genes, assigned to impossible war zones, told to do the work no one else wanted. Is it any wonder some of them fell apart? Or worse, fell silent? Still, that silence isn't total. We feel them even now, in the nightmares of Inquisitors, the paranoia of tech priests, the half-remembered prayers of chapter serfs who don't know why their rites feel older than the walls around them. The Imperium is a place built on ghosts. Ghosts of heroes, ghosts of monsters. And sometimes the only thing separating them is who got to write the history. I think that's why fans like us keep coming back to these stories. Because in a setting where everything is about certainty and absolutes, the failed chapters are the shadows in the corner of the eye. The unspoken questions, the broken logic of a system that claims perfection but can't explain its own inconsistencies. There's a kind of tragic poetry in it. These warriors weren't less brave, less loyal, or less pure. They just got lost in the cracks. And somehow, that makes them more real. So what do you think? Have you seen signs of ghost chapters in the background of campaign books, in the cryptic entries of Forge World lore, or buried in that one novel no one else read? Do you believe some of them are still out there? And if they are, should they come back? Should we let them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. These stories deserve to be remembered, whether they ended in fire, silence, or something stranger. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the ghosts of failed foundings, Make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the growing archive of hidden truths and forbidden history. We've got more coming, more mysteries, more echoes, more secrets that refuse to die. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, even the forgotten have a voice. You just have to know where to listen.